courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay, there is a point beyond which they must not advance.
And this is the point I think Americans need to comprehend. If America goes down economically, it will go down militarily. If America goes down militarily, we all go down. The free world is finished, and it'll be finished for a very, very long time.
Everything, practically, is in a self-destructive mode.
We're in the most critical period we've been since the Revolutionary War.
You're not alert, you're not awake with what's happening.
They would just as soon see this country on its knees and everything equalized.
That concept of collectivism, big government, is a magnet for the predator class.
The plans for all of this are to have everything globally in place by 2020.
If we're that dumb and we allow this to happen,
We deserve everything we're going to get, because we're going to get it right in the neck.
We're headed into what could be a nightmare that would make all the atrocities of the 20th century look like they were a dress rehearsal.
When people are afraid, they ask government to do more, not less.
Their theories are designed to scare the people to believe there's a crisis when there is not a crisis at all. There's no crisis.
I think we're losing more and more freedom because we are afraid.
The left wants you to believe that catastrophe is always just around the corner. And the only way to avoid it is to do exactly what they say. But this film will show everything they do is just a Trojan horse of deceit, carefully crafted to advance their real agenda of finishing America off.
We have been the main stumbling block to world communism since it first raised its ugly head.
From the promotion of Islam to the propaganda of climate change, from the deceit of Common Core to the manufactured economic crisis, and from their manipulation of the evangelical church to the unsustainable debt burden. This film will show the issues are simply being used as a smokescreen to hide the purposeful, premeditated, treasonous attacks on the foundations of our freedom.
The war on religion has just purged us from being able to determine right from wrong.
You know what Alexander Solzhenitsyn said about Russia? How the communists took over Russia? He said, "We forgot God."
Their stated agenda, carved in stone on a monument in Georgia and outlined in documents placed in the Ark of Hope, is to eliminate 6.5 billion people by century's end. And they will succeed if we don't stop them.
This is not just a fight for the United States of America. This is a fight for civilization itself.
It's everything Karl Marx dreamed of before our very eyes.
I think they've pushed us over the cliff in ever since. America isn't going to fall. We are falling.
"2,500 years ago, in his masterpiece, The Art of War, Sun Tzu wrote, 'If you know yourself, you will win the battle 50% of the time. If you know your enemy, you will win 50% of the time. But if you know yourself and you know your enemy, you will win 100% of the time.'"
If you don't know who we are as a nation, you don't know our identity, you don't know our history, you don't really understand the price that's been paid for America, then anybody can lead you astray.
Once we understand who we are, it will be easy to identify our enemies by those that are attacking the foundations we stand upon. So before the last 100 years of subversion, who were we? What made America the greatest country of all time? God established 3 institutions: the family, the church, and the state. And He told us exactly what their authority was to be and what was within their jurisdictions. America's greatness was that we followed God's instruction on how those institutions should be run. All 3 were created by God to protect each individual person from being abused by the collective. Every attack against us today is aimed at destroying those distinctions. It's interesting to note the Communist Manifesto states the communist goal is to destroy the family, the church, and the state, all 3 of God's institutions. So regardless of how well-intentioned, the enemies of America are all the people and groups that seek to transfer the authority God gave the family and church to the state. And they are collectivists.
Collectivism is a broad ideology that includes all of these things like communism, fascism, Nazism, socialism, left-wingism, liberalism. All of these different words are used to describe different flavors of collectivism. And collectivism is the concept that the state is all-important and that the individual must be sacrificed, if necessary, for the greater good of the greater number.
Unfortunately, the end of all collectivist schemes is a government that takes care of its citizens from the cradle to the grave, and that is Marxism. The people that don't understand this naively believe you can have big government without totalitarian methods, and history has shown us you cannot.
From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That was the grand ideal, right? But the problem has always been no one steps down. Once you have the power, no one steps down. And the reality is that beautiful picture was just a picture. It was a fiction. No one ever intended on stepping down.
Therefore, that's the reason, no matter what government you go to, whether it's the national government in Washington, D.C., or you go down to your city hall some Thursday night and take a look of who are those people sitting up there in those big chairs, you know, while the little people come in and say, well, I'd like to complain about this. And they say, your time is up, you know. Who are those people in the city hall? They're collectivists, every one of them. They're enjoying this power. They've been drawn to that power. They're predators.
Big government will never work because no one is capable of being in charge. We like to think of Hitler and Stalin as if they were uniquely evil people. But the simple truth is, every single person on the planet would have done the exact same things they did if they believed their philosophies and weren't accountable to any higher authority. Ideas have consequences. What you believe affects what you will do. They weren't uniquely evil. They were sinful men like the rest of us, but they had exceptionally bad ideas, the same ones we are playing with today.
Let me give you, if I might, an example. They have a particular program they want to implement, and they go in and they ask for everything. They ask for everything, and they're aggressive about it. They push ahead. And so they push until they get opposition, starts to build up against it. And at that given moment, they evaluate the opposition. They say, well, is there any strength to it? Will it last? Will we be able to endure it? Or do we push ahead even farther? If the movement grows up to where it can do them harm, they then back off and say, well, maybe we don't want it all. Let's compromise a little. Let us get along together now, because I'm willing to give up what I've asked for totally for just a bit of it. Aren't you willing to give up a bit that we can work together? Next thing you know, another month goes by, another year, and here they come again.
We are in a dependent state, and when you go to the voting booth, you get to vote your self-interest. So, real issue, a real concern when you don't have a voting base with some skin in the game, as much to lose as to gain. what we know from history is that when you tip the scale at 51%, now you are talking about a license to steal. You're talking about that 51% tyranny that de Tocqueville was so concerned about. The democracy, for all its benefits, the main challenge is you get to the point where you have a 51% tyranny.
I think that it's underappreciated in our society just how extensive the damage of the welfare state is. And I think that when you look into the heart of the liberal and what they do to our society in the name of social justice or in the name of equality, it's evil will.
When a government is working as hard as possible to create dependency in their citizens, you know that their real aim is to eliminate freedom, because no man is truly free that is unable to provide for himself.
The dollar in America today, it takes 98 of them to buy what $1 did in 1913 when the Federal Reserve System was enacted into law. That is theft.
The fifth plank of the Communist Manifesto is to create a central bank. Ours was created in 1913 and is called the Federal Reserve.
You say Federal Reserve, and I think most Americans think that's part of the government. But of course, the Federal Reserve Bank isn't part of the government. The Federal Reserve is a private bank.
It's not a government institution. It's as Federal Express.
What's happened is the Federal Reserve has been quietly stealing our wealth while we believe their lie that inflation is normal. It wasn't normal for the first 6,000 years of Earth history. It magically started in America in 1913. Our economic system today is based on Keynesian economics. John Maynard Keynes is the father of it. If there is any doubt to the purposefulness of our economic situation, listen to this. He said, quote, "By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens." Lenin was certainly right. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch its currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and it does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose, unquote. The second plank of the Communist Manifesto is to implement a graduated income tax. Ours was placed into law in 1914.
If you establish a tax that is based on the government's power to determine what percentage of your income it's going to take away from you, how much of your income does it control? Well, that means the government controls 100% of your income. If that is the situation, you are no longer a free person. You are a slave, and you live on an allowance from your government.
When Ronald Reagan came into office, the top tax rate was 70%. When he left office, he had cut it down to 27%. During that same time, revenue to the government doubled. The lie of the left is that increasing taxes on the rich will help stimulate the economy, and nothing could be further from the truth. It's all a strategic part of the plan to create more dependency. People wonder why our free enterprise system isn't working anymore. It's because the inflation, taxation, and regulation is effectively killing its productivity and its ability to create wealth. So now people talk about redistributing the wealth we have instead of creating more. Every single person in the world could be a millionaire. Wealth is created by hard work, creativity, and ingenuity. The lie that it's a fixed pie is perpetrated by those that seek to pit the have-nots against the haves. If you add up all the debts and obligations our government has placed on us, every single individual owes over $650,000, which obviously isn't ever going to be paid back.
That's the nature of bankruptcy. And as one writer used to say, how did you go bankrupt? Well, very slowly, and then all at once.
God said, the borrower is servant to the lender. Artificially low interest rates have encouraged everyone to be buried in debt and enslaved to the banks. When you penalize productivity and reward sloth, you know exactly what you are doing. You are making us poorer as a nation, which will create more dependency, but of course, the cycle of history doesn't stop there.
And then you find that deterioration, that move towards dictatorship, which is the stage that follows dependency, where the vast majority of people are dependent on the state, and the only way to continue to deliver what the vast majority of people expect is via the strong arm of government.
If you look at how do you change society, well, one of the things you obviously do is you go after the next generation. And you do that through the education system, and that's exactly what has happened to us. The Marxist movement in America has done exactly that.
The education system establishes the direction for the future. It sets the hearts and the minds, the perspectives of the next generation. Everybody knows how important it is.
They know that if they can get control of our children, and they can pump their ideology into these young, hungry brains, they virtually can have them captive as prisoners for life.
And you're doing it all under the banner of being internationally competitive, or college ready, or career ready. So the euphemisms hide the actual intent.
The father of global education, Robert Mueller, was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and the creator of the World Core Curriculum. He said the goal was, quote, to promote growth of the group idea so that group good, group understanding, group interrelations, and group goodwill will lead to group consciousness, unquote. His World Core Curriculum was pushed in America by George Bush Sr. as America 2000, which was renamed by Bill Clinton Goals 2000, which was then given a facelift to become George Bush Jr.'s No Child Left Behind, which was the driving force behind Barack Obama's Common Core. It's all the same thing, Republican or Democrat, progressing down the same road of complete brainwashing. Since John Dewey, the entire focus of education by the elites has been to, as quickly as possible, move the children to a collectivist mindset. The 10th plank of the Communist Manifesto states, provide a free education by the state for all children and to combine education with industrial production. Bill Gates has teamed up with the United Nations to build the model that will have our schools simply be a tax-paid training ground for corporate America.
In the end, most of this tracks back to people who would benefit financially from a more government-centric economy because they're at table. They're already political players. They don't want to worry about competition.
Not only is competition eliminated, but employees are created. The type that would be content to work 60 or 70 hours a week in a dead-end corporate job that just paid enough to survive. Traditionally, Americans would have had no interest in that. They would have wanted to use all the individual talents and abilities that God had given them. They wanted to do 100 different things in their life. Invent things, start new businesses, change the world. And the elites didn't want any of that, so it had to be destroyed.
It's like we're going after Marx's vision and at the same time making it impossible as well, because the mind arson necessary to get an amenable voter means that the wealth that you're planning on redistributing is really gone. You just don't know it yet.
Just as I was beginning to dig in, I realized I was making a big mistake. The temptation on all these different issues is to not accept the reality of how things really are. The bottom line is, our enemies are in control of the schools, so there is no fix. I know you don't want to hear that because I don't want to hear that, but it's true. They want our kids to be useful idiots. They want them to be dependent on the state. That's the goal of the whole thing. So they will repackage, rename, rebrand the same old thing over and over again. It is intentionally going downhill. We have to grasp this. It is purposeful. We legitimize them by acting like they just don't have a good idea and we have a better one. They know exactly what they are doing. They want to create a new world man that is dependent on government for his very existence. So to even talk about Common Core, debating its good points or bad points, is playing into their plan of sidetracking all of our energies and efforts on a dead-end road. Even without Common Core, the schools are completely bankrupt and destroying our children. We have seen a decline now for 70 straight years without any interruption. As long as the government has a monopoly in education, we will keep getting what we have.
And the end result is to make our children and those educated under this influence, to make them unfit to govern themselves.
What I see is that the church has become an enemy of God because it has been infiltrated with people that have degrees from elite institutions. And these are people that, they have come into the church, but they never were believers. There are some professors in divinity schools and seminaries that take delight in destroying the faith of innocent young people.
Christianity has always been the main target because they knew with a strong Christian church, their plans of a one-world government that requires a one-world religion to succeed would never be possible.
And I think that's why Christianity is a religion that people intent on despotism don't want around. The surest sign that the elites in our society are up to no good, just as the founders of our country predicted they would be, by the way, is that they're trying to get rid of Christianity. Because Christianity is what encourages people, emboldens people who live according to good conscience, acknowledging God, to stand firm in the right.
Step one was to remove God's word, the absolute authority and standard of the church.
It's as if the uncomfortable things that hold us accountable have slowly been scrubbed from the message from the pulpit. What was sin 2,000 years ago is sin today. And that's a message I think we need to hear quite often from the pulpit, and I don't hear it that much.
Research shows the majority of Americans don't believe anymore that the Bible is God's word. But a more amazing testimony to the left's success is the vast majority of seminaries in America don't either.
They realize that if you can influence churches, you can influence millions of people. So a lot of these people have had an end game in view, and part of the end game is seeking to enlist the church as pawns in their game.
Step two was to force real Christianity inside the four walls of the church, while sidetracking those that were just religious with do-gooder causes.
We Christians in the West, we are not even aware how much oppression we have in the U.S. We are persecuted without knowing it. They have told us, Christians, you can't do this. I said, yes, sir, we won't. You can't do, witness at your work. Okay, yeah, I won't. You can talk against sin. Okay, sir, we won't do it. And so gradually, we Christians, what they allow us to do, okay, you can gather in your churches on Sunday, worship the best you can, and then go home. And we have accepted that type of Christianity. We have accepted that we should not and we cannot influence our society or the government. We have accepted those limitations that the enemy has put on us. And we have withdrawn into ourselves without even realizing it.
Something that is obscene is something that shouldn't be brought into public. When are Americans, particularly people of faith, going to realize that over the course of the last 60, 70 years in our country, we have allowed them to redefine the world so that Jesus is obscene, so that God is obscene, the Ten Commandments are obscene, kids wearing a t-shirt that says Jesus saved, kicked out of school, people wearing an F word all over their clothing, they can wander around.
As I dug in to find out how this had happened, I came across testimony from the Congressional Record in 1953. Manning Johnson, who was a top communist official, testified. He said, quote, "The communists discovered that the destruction of religion could proceed much faster through infiltration of the church. It was determined that with only small forces available, it would be necessary to concentrate communist agents in seminaries and divinity schools. These institutions would make it possible for a small communist minority to influence the ideology of future clergymen. The idea was to divert the emphasis from the spiritual to the material," unquote. The testimony continued with Benjamin Gitlow, who was one of the founders of the Communist Party USA. Quote, "The Methodist Federation for Social Action was first organized by Dr. Harry Ward. Its objective was to transform the Methodist Church and Christianity into an instrument for the achievement of socialism," unquote. Dr. Harry Ward was not only a communist, he was also a member of the Fabian Socialist Society. His good friend and fellow Fabian was Dr. Walter Rosenbusch, and unbelievably, those two men started what is today the National Council of Churches.
Unfortunately, most Christians these days are tragically biblically illiterate and are accepting anything that comes down the pike that has the name Jesus stamped upon it, but it's not the agenda of the Jesus of the Bible. It's basically a satanic agenda which is seeking to displace Jesus and exalt the worship of man and creation over the Creator.
The communist goal was to turn their number one enemy, the Christian church, into their greatest asset. That monumental task is almost complete. They are turning the evangelical church into a counterfeit that worships a false God, one they have created that is only love, with a false gospel, a do-gooder works salvation instead of Christ alone, and a false mission, saving the planet instead of fulfilling the Great Commission.
You go back to the fall of the Soviet Union. Suddenly, if you were from that side of things, from the communist side of things, you're looking at the world, and there's only one superpower left, and it's the United States of America. It is the only nation on earth that is built on the ideals of limited government, free enterprise, individual liberty, private property rights. So now you've got this one superpower that is completely opposed to everything you believe in. What do? Well, the word came down to harmonize the United States into the rest of the world. You know, what would get us to do that? What would get us to throw our liberties on the bonfire like a good old-fashioned book burning? Environmental Armageddon became the choice. You've got to save the planet. And that became the mantra. And Americans bought it hook, line, and sinker. The environmental movement became the most popular movement in the country, and people were willing to be led in any direction if it meant protecting the environment. And that's pretty much how we got there.
We have to do something, they say, because we're destroying the planet, the Earth has a fever, we have to do something. And that, if it were true, would be a legitimate argument, right? But if you're screaming fire in a crowded theater, then it's a wicked argument to make when there's no fire at all. You're just trying to move people.
There are three core claims that are propping up the entire movement.
In Michigan, they've done some wonderful studies at the university level, illustrating the fact that when you increase carbon dioxide plant life grows wildly.
If you Google optimum CO2 concentration for plant growth, those plants, which all life depends on as their food source, you will find that it is 4 times the present level.
You can go back to the era here on planet Earth. Levels of carbon dioxide were probably 6 to maybe 12 times higher than today.
We're not at a high point now. We're at a low point.
Foliage was all over the planet.
Carbon pollution is now a common term that people are using, when in fact, if CO2 fell below 150 parts per million in the global atmosphere, all the plants would die. And then what would we eat? There wouldn't be anything left to eat but rocks at that point. Frost and ice are the enemy of life. You come from the tropics into the temperate zone and then the Arctic, you lose 99% of species biodiversity.
Which means that quite the opposite of what the alarmists say, global warming won't lead to more extinctions. It will lead to protecting more species from extinctions.
Over 115 different countries and territories are dying off by not having the 2.1 children per woman that is necessary for a country to survive. Population has increased in recent years because of modern medicine, and our environment has become so much cleaner. The world could easily handle 100 billion people, but it will never even reach 10 billion. As soon as this generation of elderly start dying off, population will decline for as far as the demographer's eye can see.
You know, you could move the entire population of the globe to the state of Texas, use a third of it for living space, a third for factories and workplaces, and another third for recreation, and you could leave the entire rest of the world completely uninhabited.
You don't have to dig very deep into the key people and groups involved for it to become crystal clear why they continue to promote these lies.
Karl Marx really got the entire modern environmental movement rolling. It's well documented. In fact, you can go back to 1883, a paper that was written by Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx, Dialectics of Nature. They talk about global cooling. They were trying to scare people into believing that mankind's pollution was going to put the Earth into a free fall temperature-wise, and there would be no life whatsoever. Ray Lancaster studies at the feet of Karl Marx and comes up with a saying that is really, I mean, it's at the heart of the environmental movement today. Humans are the insurgent sons of nature. Interestingly, Ray Lancaster had a disciple who was named Arthur Tainsley. Arthur Tainsley coined the term ecology. The word ecology was essentially fashioned by a disciple of Karl Marx.
In 1995, the Marxists, Democratic Socialists of America, 7,000 members, Gramsciist communists, they believe in revolution through infiltration, they took over the AFL-CIO. They took over the American Labour Movement, and they put their member, John Sweeney, in as president. And now their protege, Richard Trumka, runs it for them. What they did, they then took over every single major labour union in the country, and that leverage enabled them to take over the Democratic Party. Because there's hardly a Democrat at any level in this country, from county commission to federal, who doesn't owe his job to the unions for money, for manpower, for get out the vote, even for vote fraud. They mounted a purge at the higher levels of all the Southern Dixiecrats, the conservative Democrats, the moderate Democrats, and now the Marxists, through the unions, have completely taken over the higher reaches of the Democratic Party. So you've got 20,000 card-carrying communists in your country are dictating the policies of the Democratic Party, which is controlling the lives of 300 million Americans.
If this is hard to believe, I encourage you to go to the Communist Party USA's People's World or the Democratic Socialists of America's Democratic Left, and you will see every single issue they are promoting today will be the exact issues the Democrats will be putting on the floor of Congress tomorrow.
And you've got all these loyal Democrats out there, good patriotic people, who still think they're voting for Harry Truman and JFK. Look, by the standards of today, do you think Harry Truman or JFK would have a chance in today's Democratic Party? Those guys today would probably be in the Tea Party. Yet their party is now run by communists, and all these loyal Democrats all over this country are still voting on party lines and basically voting for Marxists and anti-Americans because they do not understand their party has been taken over.
It's no longer just an opposing party with different views. It is our enemy working as fast and furious as they can to finish the quiet revolution that started over 100 years ago. And that is why every issue is being used against us as a weapon to destroy.
So the process is simple. The Marxists set a policy. It might be socialisation of student loans, or green jobs, or cap and trade, or card check, or a New START treaty with Russia, or Obamacare, or immigration amnesty. They're behind the campaign to end fracking. They're behind the gutting of your military. They're behind the dumbing down of your schools and Common Core. All of these programs that are affecting every American every day is being orchestrated by small Marxist groups who have been able to take over the labour movement of this country, and by doing that they then took over the Democratic Party and are now running the country. They're effectively running the country.
I contend that sooner or later they will use violence. They'll use violence when they get to a certain percentage. If they can get 70% of the people behind them, they will wipe out their opposition, because the socialist communists cannot stand competition.
They have to take America down, then they can have world government, and the communists will then throw off their mask and they will have worldwide Leninism. That is their plan.
Like my pastor, he spent 5 years in prison. My cousin's husband, he spent 9 years in prison. He was a pastor. Because they say, no, you cannot worship in this way. You can worship to your God only as we say to you. So when government coming inside in our lifestyle, it's really bad for us. It's really bad. So don't want to live through this again, but I am living it. You know, every day is one more provision, one more thing that you cannot say, and I don't know.
It's no secret that totalitarianism resulted in the slaughter of hundreds of millions of people during the 20th century. But what most people don't realize is that the environmental movement is now setting the stage for the slaughter in this century of billions. Since humans have now been labeled the greatest enemy of Earth, and the planet has been elevated to God status through the resurrection of ancient paganism, things that were once unthinkable are now becoming thinkable. If you don't think there's a religious element to this, they have made an exact replica of the Ark of the Covenant from the Bible to carry Mr. Gorbachev's Earth Charter. And people literally are worshiping it, praying to it, and placing gifts before it. And if you think this new paganism won't include things like human sacrifice, think again. Just during the 8 years of Obama, the child sacrifice worldwide through abortion has exceeded 320 million babies, the entire population of the United States.
Under the new Agenda 21 movement, we've been demoted. We are now below the earth. And if we are less than the earth, then there is no tyranny against man that cannot be justified under the premise of protecting the environment.
Honest environmentalists will all tell you, well, a good number would be, we have 7 billion now. They won't say a billion, they'll say probably a few 100 million. Okay, then you ask them, how are we going to get to that number? How are we going to get to that number? And they look at you with a blank look. Because abortion and sterilization isn't going to get us there, so how are we going to get there? And then I will always ask them the question, you want a war? Will a war work for you? How about a plague? Will a plague work for you? How about starvation? Will starvation work for you? And you know, in the back of their mind, they're thinking all those things will work for them, because there's no way you're going to reduce that many people on the planet to get it to where they think it's sustainable. And of course, at the same time, they're thinking, and I'm going to be one of the chosen ones who will be allowed to live.
The odds are against us. We have seen the trends move in the direction to oppose the Christian faith, to oppose family, freedom. Socialism is on the rise. And I think people are intimidated by the giants. What we need are Davids who show up and say, who is this uncircumcised Philistine who should defy the armies of the living God? Who does this big guy think he is? And then you go and get your 5 stones and you launch one into the head of this thing. That's what we need.
Some of the signs to look for to discern as to whether or not you're in an apostate church. It's important to see, is a pastor preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ crucified on the cross for our sins, buried, resurrected again? Is he preaching the message of the gospel and eternal judgment, and the fact that we don't live very long on this earth and we're going to stand before God and give an account as to whether or not we've embraced the grace of God through Christ Jesus? Is he preaching repentance, that you must turn from sin and embrace Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior? If you don't see that in a fellowship and there's another agenda afoot, I would say, run and don't walk to the nearest exit.
We need those of you that are pastors to stand up and lead and only be concerned about one thing. What does God think about what you're doing? And we need those of you that are Christians to share the gospel faithfully. Most under 30 in America have never even heard the truth about Jesus. 67% of non-Christians have never even been invited to church. This is unacceptable. The complete transformation that takes place with salvation is the only real hope for America.
I think it begins right at home, in your own heart, in your own mind. Reform takes place there, and then it begins to work its way out. The multiplication which occurred, the revolution which occurred in the first century, was a revolution of individuals' hearts. And you began to see this mushroom effect that took place in individual homes only because individuals were changed. And then communities changed. And then the world was radically altered for the good as a result.
I think the day of the Sunshine Patriot and the Fairweather Christian are coming to an end. We're going to have to pick what side we are on. And there's not 10 different options. There's only 2. We will either be on God's side, living a pure life, standing for His laws, regardless of the cost, or we will be on man's side, which means we are the enemy of God.